Welcome back everybody to Environmental Science. Here we have Unit 2, Section 2, our History of Environmental Science. The short version. Not all of it. That'd take a while. So this is pulled from a tomb in Egypt. One of the older depictions of agriculture. I think this is something like 12,000 BCE for the date. Person was buried. Art on the tomb reflects agricultural practices at the time. We'll get to that in a moment. So first we start with prehistoric world. There's a lot of misconceptions and different ideas and images that get conflated here. So I'm hoping we can get this a little bit more focused. Just broadly, right, prehistory doesn't mean before anything happened. It means prior to the advent of writing, like written language, written documents, right, to preserve what happened, which happens around 3400-ish BC, depending on where you are. Later in a lot of other areas outside of Mesopotamia, which, as we'll see, is where a lot of the firsts happen. Okay, so what's going on in prehistory? So we'll leave off some of the stuff that's further back than any sort of human beings, whether earlier or Homo sapiens, right? But we're just going to say, hand wave, since time eternal, human beings have used their environment to meet their needs, right? For as long as there have been human beings, they've been doing that. How about that? And we talk about their material needs from the environment. What does that specifically refer to? It would be a good list to kind of remember and internalize, right? Food, water, energy, shelter, clothing, medicine, transportation. Now, you could argue that some of these could be combined, or maybe that the list needs to be a little bit longer, but this is going to be a really great list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things for us to start out with here. And have those needs changed over time? Not really, right? If you want to evaluate somebody's quality of life anywhere in the world, you can look at those 7 things, right? This has not changed. Environment is still our resource base. And as far as what's going on in prehistory, or the prehistoric era, we can do these 3 things, right? Fire, forests, and farming. Okay, so we'll start with fire. Here we have the famous flint and steel method, it looks like. Although, really, you could use flint and rock if you were at 400,000 BCE. Evidence is complicated as far as how this is known, but there's a lot of burned remains and evidence of burning back here, using fire for the purpose of cooking, being able to get more energy out of your environment, and that is going to sort of hint at one of our ecological concepts later of metabolic processes and getting energy through the environment. The flow of energy and matter through the environment is a very foundational concept there. Used for cooking, right? So yeah, so stone and flint is our method here. It could also be friction and wood. Still works, believe it or not, hasn't changed, kind of amazing. And get our course concept. So movement of energy through different organisms. We can skip ahead, so this skips ahead a lot, right? So it was 400,000 BCE, now we get to about 20,000 BCE here. You could maybe call this the earliest era of the Stone Age. Not the best term, but gets the right idea. So this is going to be our earliest evidence of mostly smaller scale cultivation of edible grasses and these other things, right? So barley, peas, lentils. This is going to be in the Sea of Galilee area, which is close to modern day Israel. Eastern Mediterranean, there's a lot of different terms that refer to it, but we're kind of in the same area here. You might have learned about the Fertile Crescent way back when, which is not the greatest concept, but it works, right? And yeah, it didn't replace herding. So we have a combination of herding and farming to be able to meet people's need for food. We skip ahead a little bit here, right, to 6,000 BCE. So we're still before the advent of writing. Forests provide timber, raw material that is critical to everything happening through this prehistoric time period. Yeah, so here we have the latest part of the Stone Age, call it the Neolithic. Neo is new, lith is stone, so new Stone Age, latest part. So we have some recordings here of deforestation issues, environmental issues in southern Levant. Again, that's going to be equivalent roughly to modern day Israel. And then we also have development by this time of irrigation, and this is what we actually see here. So this is not the southern Levant, this is the Nile River, right? Flows north up through Egypt. Here we have the Great Nile Delta, named Delta because somebody thought that it looks like a triangle, which it kind of does, though how they would have observed it from this angle that long ago is kind of amazing. Okay. So reclamation, right? Irrigation. So this is controlling the flow of the Nile River to be able to get a steady water flow for crops. Now, we are going to do much more on irrigation, benefits, drawbacks, complications later on when we do water resources, but keep in mind, right, irrigation projects, societies as well, all fail, except for ours, historically. One reason or another. However, prehistoric Egypt had a little bit of a different system for doing this. We'll get into the details later on. Classical Greece, right? So moving ahead, we are long past the advent of written language here, about 400 BCE. Have our Greek physician Hippocrates. You might be familiar with the Hippocratic Oath. People go to become a doctor. They have to talk about, how they would do no harm. Comes from this person. Have some early writings here on the effect of food and occupation and climate in causing disease. A link between those two. There's not a lot of writings that document that specifically. Maybe you could claim that it was widely known, though, by this time, right? And just as an example, using massages with olive oil to be able to increase body temperature. So here we have an interaction between an environmental product and a person, especially like an athlete, right? And eating figs to provide this boost of energy through sugars. So we can move ahead a little bit from Greece up into classical Rome here. So here we're in Common Era. Everything up through this point out is going to be AD or CE, Common Era, however you want to call it. Not quite ancient isn't the best word. I should say classical Rome. Occupational disease, though, by this time is somewhat known. So lead poisoning, heavy metal poisoning, and mercury poisoning as well is something that is well known by this time period. And just as a fun fact, those of us in Phoenix might be familiar with the Dreamy Draw Park or area near the Phoenix Mountains. Reason it's called Dreamy Draw is because of the mercury mine, and because the people who were going down to mine it would be poisoned and slowly, over time, develop psychotic symptoms and act a bit goofy, just as a fun fact there. Moving ahead, so some of the earliest writings that document climate change in particular come out of China. There's about 1000 CE. It would be equivalent to their medieval period, something like Song Dynasty China. Name is Shen Kuo. It's going to be in the modern-day Yunnan, which is approximately located in the center. It's a really bad way to describe it, but like center-west. But it's not rainforest, right? So in the modern day, this is not somewhere that can develop bamboo or grow it. Bamboo takes a lot of rain to grow. So just for context, right? There's a landslide in an area nearby. He goes and he discovers this underground cavity with tons and tons of petrified bamboo. He is in an area where bamboo does not grow because there is nowhere near enough rain, and comes to this conclusion that the only way that's possible is if the climate of his area had shifted over time. So it was less arid before, got more rain, and now it is more arid. We can move on to about 1300 in England. So the development of house coal, you'll notice the end date on this one. This is sort of a modern depiction of it, not how it would have looked in 1300, but it's surprisingly hard to find a good drawing of what house coal use in 14th century England would have looked like. If you find an image that depicts that and is really good, please send it to me because I couldn't find one. So, used in England mostly for heating the home, so domestic heating. We're pulling energy out of our environment in a different way, right? This time from a hydrocarbon source, this coal, right? Black rock, you burn it, it releases lots of heat, and there is a lot of coal available in England and in Northern Europe generally. This is now illegal as of May of 2023, and I guess I will just leave this one as a mystery, though maybe it's not too hard to figure out why that would be the case. Moving not too far ahead, this time a small jump. So 1300 for domestic heating with coal in England. Now we have 1350s approximately for a while. The bubonic plague, otherwise known as the Black Death, moves through Europe and Asia and kills a lot of people. It's about a third, roughly, of Europe. Varies a lot depending on who you ask and how you choose to assess these things. Something like a 30 to 90% death rate. Really horrible. Comes from grain ships. So here we have the interconnectedness of the world playing a role. So these are grain ships. They have rats. The fleas which have the disease bite the rats on the grain ship, and those rats come up into Europe and spread the Black Plague that way. This leads to some of the first public health and quarantine laws and procedures. So this was not necessarily the most scientific of approach. It may be more along the lines of oh, you're new to the city, okay, you're going to go here and stay for like 2 weeks while we make sure that you don't have any symptoms. Nobody comes in until they have gone through that process whatsoever, which may be actually kind of a smart policy. More on that later. Moving ahead to about 1400, right? Tribal collapse in Arizona. So it's about 1400, modern day Arizona, was not at the time, our collapse of the ancestral Hohokam people. So these are the people who are believed to be the ancestors of modern day Salt River, or at least they believe themselves to be the descendants of the Hohokam people. There's a lot of resolution lost in the meantime, right? Between today and 600 years ago. The reasons why the collapse are not totally known. Could have been irrigation, could have been related to a severe drought, which we know happened, though hard to know if it's the only cause. Could have been related to disease. It is a reclamation society. Irrigation comes with issues that built up over time, silt, salt, and failures of human planning, and extreme events like drought can make it worse. Moving ahead, about 1500, we have contact between the so-called Old World and the New World. And I have this just to kind of piece together what this thing is, the Columbian Exchange. So we have disease, we have these other, many of which are crops and environmental elements that are transferring between these. We have a world that is growing more interconnected. And that's not just a sort of, platitude or thing to say. It has real material consequences on what happens. And we'll eventually talk about why that is mathematically, which is interesting. Yeah, and so we have our big three issues from before, right? Maybe you can pause here and try to remember what those were. So, war, infectious disease, and environmental issues. What are going to be the issues here that change the course of the world? War, infectious disease, and environmental issues. Yeah. Skipping ahead to our Industrial Revolution. This is going to be about 1750 to kick off, depending on where you are. I stole this definition from National Geographic because it's better than mine. Transition from making goods by hand to making goods by machine. Cannot state it better than that. That's perfect. You have increased demand for things like coal. Raw materials actually leads to a ton of exploration and development and the founding of this field called geology that maybe you've heard of, in large part in response to people trying to figure out where coal and other materials are in the ground, be able to pull more of them out. Rapid expansion of imperial militaries and navies, which becomes global, so our global interconnectedness steps up yet again, and widespread colonization of the developing world, right, all over, largely to get these raw materials that are needed to manufacture goods and make a lot of money and serve the empire. So moving ahead about 100 years here, as an early example of an environmental fail and then success. So we go back to England, specifically London. It's 1858. It's a particularly hot year, and there was a river that runs through it, kind of meanders through as one does in London, called the Thames, is how they pronounce it. And up until this point, the Thames was used for drinking water for the city and also for sewage. That's what they did. Now, that poses immediate problems, things like cholera, dysentery that would have been spread through the water. And in this particular year, it was hot and it smelled horrible. I think I recall something about like a parliamentary session that had to be canceled because the river smelled so bad that they just couldn't get anything done. It's amazing considering how many other things would have been unpleasant at the time. Did they necessarily know why? No. There would have been early theories of disease related to, bad air coming in and miasma, sort of speculative more than anything else. This gentleman, who kind of has a sick mustache, Joseph Bazalgette, designed the sewer system for London, and it's really good, and it's still in use to this day, right? So this is an early example of environmental engineering and a great success. So had the foresight to realize that more people were going to live there in the future. How we could have predicted that, I don't know. Yeah. So I am actually going to pause here. We're going to split this to a new video for the second half of our history section. Stay tuned.